He was a billionaire's son who couldn't win a single debate until a janitor revealed the secret that changed everything. Alexander Hawthorne, the only son of the world-famous billionaire Gregory Hawthorne, had everything money could buy: luxury cars, private tutors, and summer trips around the globe. Yet, despite his wealth and privilege, there was one area where he could never succeed: debates. In school, university, and even private forums organized by his father's company, Alexander would crumble under scrutiny. His arguments were weak, his confidence thin, and his opponents often left him humiliated. One evening, after another crushing loss at a prestigious debate, Alexander stormed into the building's basement, frustrated and desperate. That's where he first noticed James, the black janitor, quietly mopping the floor, humming a tune that somehow carried wisdom in its simplicity. When Alexander muttered to himself, "Why am I so terrible at this?" James paused, looked up, and said softly, "Maybe you're looking for answers in the wrong place." Something about that calm, unassuming man intrigued Alexander. Little did he know, this janitor held the secret that could change his life forever. The next day, Alexander returned to the basement with a mixture of anticipation and arrogance that made James raise an eyebrow. "Teach me," Alexander demanded, almost as if the words themselves were a command rather than a request. James, who had once been a world-class debater traveling the world, winning tournaments and shaping the minds of young prodigies, had seen people like Alexander countless times, privileged, impatient, and convinced that the world owed them instant mastery. Yet he simply smiled, the corners of his mouth twitching in a way that suggested he found the challenge more amusing than daunting. "Debate isn't about facts," James said after a long pause, "or about showing off what you know. It's about understanding people, feeling the conversation, and knowing how to guide it." Alexander frowned slightly, unsure if James was mocking him, but he felt a flicker of curiosity spark within him, something that had rarely appeared when someone spoke to him without flattery or fear. Over the next few weeks, James began training Alexander in ways that were both subtle and profoundly transformative. He didn't start with speeches or arguments. Instead, he began by observing Alexander as he spoke, noticing the tension in his jaw, the overuse of hand gestures, the moments when his mind raced ahead of his words. "You are trying to be impressive," James said one day, leaning back on a worn stool and tapping his fingers together. "That is not what moves people. People feel sincerity, they feel understanding, and they respond to someone who listens as much as they speak." Alexander, for once, was silent, allowing the words to sink in. Then James introduced him to the art of reading the opponent's mood. It wasn't about guessing what they would say next or memorizing debate tactics. It was about watching closely, the flicker of an eye, a subtle shift in posture, a brief hesitation. These, James explained, were windows into the mind, the unspoken truths that often determine the outcome of any argument. Alexander practiced relentlessly, learning to sense when his counterpart was frustrated, uncertain, or overconfident. Next came the lessons in questioning. James taught Alexander that asking the right question was more powerful than delivering a perfect monologue. Questions, properly placed, could unsettle even the most experienced opponents, leading them to reveal their own weaknesses without realizing it. Alexander learned the art of phrasing, of timing, of silence after a question, letting the moment stretch just long enough to create tension and curiosity. But perhaps the most difficult lesson was learning to control himself under pressure. Alexander had always relied on his family's reputation, his wealth, and his ego to navigate conversations and debates. When challenged, he had a habit of snapping, of trying to dominate, of proving himself rather than engaging genuinely. James forced him into uncomfortable exercises, timed debates with no preparation, mock scenarios where Alexander's points were deliberately attacked, and situations where he had to defend positions he didn't even agree with. At first, Alexander failed spectacularly. He stuttered, grew red in the face, and sometimes stormed out, convinced he would never master what James considered the subtle arts. But James never gave up, never scolded, never mocked. He simply guided, corrected, and reminded Alexander that mastery was a slow process, one that required patience, observation, and humility. Slowly, Alexander began to change. He noticed his own reactions, the flare of anger, the tug of pride, the impulse to interrupt. He began to speak less, to listen more, to choose his words carefully, and to measure their impact. He started practicing not for the sake of winning, but for the sake of connection, realizing that a truly persuasive argument was not a performance but a conversation. Week by week, Alexander's skills improved, but more importantly, so did his character. He began to see the world not as an audience waiting to be impressed, but as a network of individuals, each with their own fears, desires, and motivations. He learned empathy in ways he never had before, understanding that debate was not conquest but influence, not dominance but guidance. One afternoon, James introduced him to an exercise that seemed simple but was deceptively powerful. They sat in the basement, no scripts, no topics, just a timer. James would speak for 1 minute about a mundane topic, anything from the best way to brew coffee to the ethics of tipping. And Alexander's task was to respond in a way that engaged, questioned, and persuaded without showing off. Alexander faltered at first, fumbling words, misreading tones, missing cues. But gradually, as he listened intently, as he focused on the emotional undertone of James's speech rather than its content, he began to respond with precision. He asked questions that made James pause, made subtle observations that drew acknowledgement, and slowly, the arrogance that had once dominated his speech gave way to a calm, confident presence. By the end of the month, Alexander was no longer the same person who had stormed into James's basement demanding instruction. He had learned to read rooms, to gauge reactions, to pivot arguments effortlessly, and most importantly, to speak authentically. James watched him with quiet pride, knowing that the transformation was not just in skill but in the young man's soul. Alexander, once entitled and brash, had discovered a version of himself that was grounded, deliberate, and genuinely persuasive. And as he left the basement one evening, he realized that he had not only learned how to debate but had been taught how to connect, to influence, and to lead, not through arrogance but through understanding. He felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and humility, a sensation that had been foreign to him all his life. For the first time, Alexander understood that true power was not inherited or demanded. It was cultivated, nurtured through observation, practice, and empathy. And in that understanding, he found a confidence that no amount of money, fame, or privilege could ever provide. Weeks had passed since Alexander had begun his intense training under James, and those weeks had been filled with challenges, mistakes, and slow but steady progress. The arrogant, entitled young man who had once stormed into a basement demanding instruction was now a different person, or at least, he was starting to become one. Alexander had learned to control his impulses, to read subtle cues in people's expressions, to craft arguments that were not just factually sound but emotionally resonant. Yet despite all the training, there remained a gnawing anxiety in his chest as he prepared for his first real test. A local university debate open to students, faculty, and a smattering of curious townspeople. This was not a grand stage like the international forums he had imagined dominating, nor were there cameras or reporters. But in his mind, it was every bit as significant. He arrived early, nerves buzzing under his calm exterior, dressed in a simple blazer and neatly pressed shirt, trying not to let his wealth or his past influence how others perceived him. His opponents, a pair of senior students known for their sharp wit and commanding presence, looked him over with thinly veiled disdain. Whispers floated through the small hall, murmurs of amusement and skepticism. "Oh, it's the billionaire's son," one muttered. "This will be easy." The confidence in their sneers only tightened the knot in Alexander's stomach, reminding him of the arrogance he had shed but not entirely forgotten. James had accompanied him, but he sat quietly in the back row, observing, as he always did, allowing Alexander to face the challenge on his own. When Alexander stepped onto the stage, he took a slow, measured breath. The murmuring audience quieted, sensing something different in his demeanor. There was no smug grin, no haughty posture, only a poised, attentive young man who seemed fully present in the room. As the debate began, Alexander quickly realized that James' lessons were not just about tactics but about presence. He listened more than he spoke, noticing the subtle shifts in his opponent's tone and body language. When one of the students raised a counterargument, Alexander paused, feeling the weight of the room, noting the slight hesitation in his rival's eyes, the subtle tension in their shoulders. Then, carefully, he responded, not with a barrage of facts or an attempt to overwhelm, but with a series of questions and reflections that guided the audience to see the point he wished to make. He framed his arguments in ways that connected to the listener's own experiences, weaving logic and empathy into a single, seamless thread. He drew comparisons, asked questions that invited participation, and highlighted underlying assumptions in a manner that felt natural and not confrontational. Each point he made was met with attentive silence, the kind that suggested the audience was not just hearing him but thinking with him. As the debate continued, Alexander's confidence grew, not from pride but from clarity. He could feel the subtle influence he had on the room, the way people leaned in slightly when he spoke, the way their expressions softened or sharpened in response to his tone. He realized that James had been right all along. Debate was not a battle to dominate but a dance to guide, not a performance to impress but a conversation to illuminate. The turning point came when one of his opponents, growing frustrated, launched into a rapid series of attacks, trying to rattle Alexander and provoke a reaction. Alexander felt the familiar flicker of irritation rise in his chest. The old him would have snapped back, tried to crush the opponent with verbal force, but he stopped himself. He inhaled, allowed the moment to stretch, and responded with a calm, measured question that subtly exposed a flaw in the argument without ever sounding condescending. The room seemed to pause, the audience leaning in as if suspended in time. A few moments later, gentle nods and murmurs of approval spread across the hall. By the end of the debate, Alexander's approach had turned skepticism into admiration. The applause that erupted was not the loud, mocking laughter of those amused by wealth or bravado. It was genuine, the sound of a room recognizing someone who had earned their respect through skill, clarity, and sincerity. Alexander's chest swelled, not with entitlement, but with a profound sense of accomplishment. He had faced judgment, scrutiny, and pressure, and he had emerged not only victorious but transformed in his understanding of what it meant to persuade. After the debate, as the crowd dispersed, Alexander stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city lights flickering around him, and he found James waiting near the janitor's closet where they had first begun. James leaned casually against the wall, hands in his pockets, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad for a beginner," he said, his voice calm, almost teasing. Alexander approached, a genuine smile spreading across his face, a smile that was no longer calculated or performed but authentic. "Thanks," he said simply, the word carrying the weight of gratitude and pride. For the first time, he felt the full measure of what he had earned, not inherited: skill, patience, empathy, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he had faced a challenge on his own terms. James nodded, his eyes gleaming with quiet approval. "Remember," he said, "the applause is nice, but it's not the victory. The victory is in knowing you can understand and guide, even when no one is watching, even when the stakes feel small. That is power." Alexander felt those words settle deep within him, a seed that would grow with each challenge he faced. As they walked together through the streets, the city alive with life around them, Alexander realized that his journey had truly begun. The taste of victory was sweeter than he had imagined, not because of recognition or applause, but because it was earned, because it had required patience, reflection, and the courage to change. And in that moment, he understood that the true challenge of life and debate alike was not to conquer others but to master oneself, to transform weakness into strength, arrogance into authenticity, and fear into confidence. Alexander's eyes met James as they turned a corner, and for the first time there was no need for words. The silent acknowledgement between teacher and student carried a depth neither of them could fully express, a shared understanding that this victory, small though it seemed in the grand scope of the world, was the first of many, and it had been won not through inherited privilege, but through dedication, humility, and the willingness to learn from the most unlikely of teachers. The news of Alexander's rapid transformation spread like wildfire through the elite circles of academia, business, and social networks. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into conversations, and soon it seemed as though everyone who knew the Hawthorne name, or had once dismissed him, was watching closely. The billionaire's son, long considered entitled and incapable, had evolved into a young man whose skill, composure, and intellect were suddenly undeniable. But Alexander knew that none of this recognition mattered if he could not prove himself on the stage that truly counted. He had been invited to participate in a prestigious global debate hosted in one of the most renowned auditoriums in the world. The audience would be unlike any he had faced before. University scholars with razor-sharp intellects, influential policymakers, prominent business leaders, and of all people, his father, Gregory Hawthorne. Alexander's stomach twisted when he thought of his father's presence. Gregory had always been distant, critical, and skeptical, a man whose expectations had never seemed achievable no matter how much Alexander accomplished. This debate was more than a competition. It was a proving ground, a crucible that would determine if the lessons James had imparted had truly transformed him. The night before, Alexander could hardly sleep. He replayed every session he had shared with James, every correction, every subtle lesson in timing, observation, and emotional intelligence. He remembered James' calm voice echoing in his mind. "Control the conversation, don't let it control you. Every argument is a doorway, every response is a choice. Master yourself first and the rest will follow." As the morning sun crept through the curtains of his room, Alexander dressed meticulously, not for appearance but for focus. He carried no airs of wealth or privilege this time. Every step he took toward the grand auditorium was measured, deliberate, each one grounding him in the present moment. The hall itself was awe-inspiring, a cathedral of intellect and rhetoric. Rows of polished seats stretched endlessly, filled with distinguished figures whose reputations alone could intimidate any ordinary debater. The air hummed with anticipation and the subtle rustle of notes as assistants hurried past, adjusting microphones and ensuring the stage lights captured every angle. When Alexander stepped onto the stage, the weight of expectation pressed against him like a physical force. Cameras zoomed, lenses tracked, whispers rippled through the crowd, and he saw the most daunting figure of all, his father, seated in the front row, his sharp gaze fixed upon him, an unreadable expression on his face. His hands clenched slightly, and he felt the old fear, of failure, of inadequacy, rise up. But he inhaled, recalling James' words. He remembered the countless hours spent learning to steady his voice, to pace his speech, to read his opponents, to turn pressure into an ally rather than an adversary. The debate began with the moderator outlining a complex, multifaceted topic that required not only intelligence but strategic thinking and impeccable composure. The opening arguments were delivered with precision and authority. Alexander's opponent, a renowned young debater known for aggressive, cutting logic, attacking every weakness he could find. Alexander felt the familiar flicker of anxiety, but it was tempered now by focus. He did not flinch, did not rush. He observed, noted, and listened. The first opportunity came when the opponent attempted to corner him with a logical trap designed to exploit a minor oversight in his initial statements. Alexander's instinct had once been to defend aggressively, to overpower with words. Now he paused, allowed the moment to stretch, and responded with a calm, probing question that subtly reframed the discussion. The audience shifted in their seats, drawn in by the clarity and poise of his response. He could feel the tension ease, a ripple of curiosity spreading across the room. As the debate continued, Alexander navigated the minefield of counterarguments with the skills he had honed under James' tutelage. He combined strategy with empathy, appealing to both logic and emotion. He illustrated abstract ideas with vivid real-world examples that resonated with everyone, from scholars to policymakers. He asked questions that challenged assumptions without belittling, drew analogies that illuminated complex issues, and maintained an unshakable calm that subtly guided the room's attention toward his perspective. At one point, his opponent grew visibly frustrated, raising their voice in a rapid succession of attacks meant to destabilize him. Alexander's heartbeat quickened, but he did not react impulsively. Instead, he paused, smiled faintly, and posed a single, carefully considered question that turned the opponent's argument against itself. The hall fell silent, the weight of expectation pressing on every listener, and then slowly, a murmur of acknowledgement spread. The audience began leaning forward, captivated not by performance but by mastery, authenticity, and clarity. Alexander could feel the energy shift in the room, a subtle current of respect and engagement flowing toward him. Hours seemed to compress into moments as he maintained focus, speaking and listening, asserting without dominating, guiding without controlling. Each statement was deliberate, each gesture purposeful, each pause strategic. By the time the final round concluded, the applause was overwhelming, not the polite claps given to a wealthy heir, but genuine appreciation for skill, intellect, and poise. Alexander felt a rush unlike anything before, elation, relief, and a profound sense of accomplishment intertwined. He had not merely survived the debate, he had mastered it. He had turned fear into clarity, pressure into composure, and knowledge into influence. As the judges conferred and the final result was announced, Alexander's father rose from his seat. Gregory Hawthorne's expression, usually unreadable and critical, softened. He clapped slowly, deliberately, and Alexander caught the glimmer of pride in his eyes, a rare and treasured acknowledgement that spoke volumes. "I see now," Gregory said quietly, just enough for Alexander to hear. "I see you've changed." Alexander exhaled, the tension of weeks, months, and years melting away in that single moment. He realized that his victory was not measured by applause or recognition, but by the transformation within himself, the ability to listen, to connect, to guide, and to master not only the debate but his own impulses and doubts. After the ceremony, as the auditorium emptied, Alexander found James waiting quietly near the exit. The janitor-turned-mentor smiled knowingly. "You did well," he said simply. "But remember, this was just one test. Mastery is a lifelong pursuit. Never stop learning, never stop observing, never stop connecting." Alexander nodded, a renewed determination settling in his chest. He had faced the test that truly mattered, not to prove to the world or even his father that he could succeed, but to prove to himself that the lessons he had embraced, the patience, the empathy, the skillful control of mind and emotion, were real, and that he could carry them forward into any challenge, no matter how daunting. That night, as he walked alone through the quiet streets, the lights of the city reflecting in his eyes, Alexander felt a sense of calm triumph. He understood now that true power was measured not by wealth, influence, or inherited privilege, but by mastery of oneself, the ability to rise above fear and arrogance, and the courage to grow continuously. And as he gazed at the stars overhead, he silently thanked the man who had taught him that lesson, the most unlikely teacher who had seen potential in someone others had dismissed, and had guided him to discover a strength he never knew he possessed. The roar of applause from the global debate still echoed faintly in Alexander's mind as he stepped off the stage, a quiet exhilaration settling over him like a warm cloak. He had achieved what once seemed impossible, not through the force of his family name or the weight of inherited privilege, but through discipline, patience, and an almost uncanny ability to understand people. Yet despite the accolades, the awards, and the fleeting admiration of peers and strangers alike, Alexander felt an undeniable pull toward the familiar, toward the place where his transformation had begun, in the dimly lit basement where he had first met James. The building's old elevator groaned as it descended, each metallic creak echoing like a heartbeat through the quiet corridors. Alexander's thoughts wandered back over the months, the long, grueling hours of practice, the moments of self-doubt when he had almost quit, the tiny victories that had stacked upon one another until he was no longer the spoiled, entitled son who had stormed into James' basement months ago demanding instruction. When he arrived at the basement door, he hesitated for just a moment, taking in the familiar smell of cleaning solution, worn wood, and faint traces of dust. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a soft glow over the cement floor where so many of his lessons had unfolded. "James," Alexander called softly, almost reverently, as if speaking louder would break the fragile stillness. A quiet chuckle responded from the corner, and Alexander's eyes found the janitor, quietly tending to his mop and bucket with the same methodical care that had characterized every session they had shared. "I couldn't have done it without you," Alexander said, approaching cautiously. His voice was steady, sincere, not the commanding tone of a young man used to giving orders, but the humble, reflective voice of someone who had been transformed. James paused, tilting his head slightly as he regarded Alexander with eyes that had seen triumph and failure in equal measure. "You did the work, Alexander," he said finally, a soft grin spreading across his face. "I just showed you the path. Remember this, anyone can learn, but not everyone can listen." Those words, so simple and yet so profound, settled over Alexander like a tide. He realized that the lessons he had absorbed went far beyond the mechanics of debate, the timing of a question, the phrasing of an argument, the art of reading an opponent's mood. The true lesson had always been about humility, about listening with intent, about patience and observation, and about the quiet strength that comes not from dominating others, but from mastering oneself. Alexander sank onto a worn stool near the wall, watching James move methodically, each stroke of the mop a reminder of the quiet diligence and consistency that had shaped his own transformation. He thought about how easy it would have been to let the accolades go to his head, to assume that his father's nod of approval or the applause of thousands validated his worth. But in the dim light of the basement, he felt a deeper satisfaction, a sense that he had earned something far more enduring than recognition. It was wisdom, tempered by experience, and the knowledge that mastery required effort, reflection, and respect for those who had guided him along the way. Alexander realized that the lessons he had learned from James were not meant to end with him. They were tools, principles, and approaches that could be shared, that could help others find their own voices, their own strength, and their own confidence. Over the following weeks, Alexander began mentoring a small circle of students and young professionals, those who were eager to learn, those who were willing to listen, those who had raw talent but lacked guidance. He found himself repeating James' lessons almost word for word: the importance of listening, of empathy, of patience, the subtle art of reading people, guiding conversations, and turning weaknesses into strengths. And yet, each time he taught, he felt the familiar thrill of discovery, the quiet satisfaction of seeing others grow, the realization that knowledge truly multiplied when shared rather than hoarded. Yet no matter how much he achieved or how many he mentored, Alexander never forgot the man who had changed the trajectory of his life. He returned often to the basement, sometimes in silence, sometimes with questions or ideas, and James was always there, quietly observing, gently guiding when needed, and always reminding him that the most profound lessons often came from the simplest places. One evening, after a particularly long day spent coaching a group of students, Alexander found James finishing up his work, the mop gliding rhythmically across the floor, the scent of freshly cleaned tiles filling the air. The janitor paused and looked up, giving Alexander a small, knowing smile. "You've done well," James said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of pride and satisfaction that was unmistakable. Alexander returned the smile, a quiet understanding passing between them. He had grown in skill, in confidence, and in character, but he also understood that the journey was ongoing, that mastery was not a destination but a lifelong pursuit. And somewhere in that building's basement, James smiled to himself, quietly satisfied, knowing that another life had been changed, not by wealth, influence, or privilege, but by wisdom, patience, and guidance. Alexander lingered for a moment, watching James move with quiet dignity, and he realized that the greatest victories were not those celebrated on stages or in auditoriums, but those that occurred in private, in the silent transformation of character and heart. In that moment, Alexander understood the most important lesson of all. Success was fleeting, applause was temporary, and recognition was superficial. But the ability to listen, to learn, and to pass on knowledge could shape not only one life but countless others. As he left the basement that night, the lights flickering gently behind him, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. He had begun as a young man seeking to prove himself, but he was leaving as someone who had discovered the true power of humility, empathy, and guidance. He had learned that victory was more than skill, it was integrity; more than talent, it was patience; more than wealth, it was wisdom. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the building, James continued his work, mopping the floor with steady hands, smiling softly to himself, knowing that yet another life had been forever changed, and that the lessons of listening, observing, and teaching would ripple outward, long after the lights had dimmed. Alexander knew one truth above all. The path James had shown him was not a path to fame, but a path to purpose, and walking it would forever define who he was and who he would become.